Hello, welcome to this special episode of this week's lesson. We're going to be studying the book of Matthew for the next 6 months, but the first lesson actually covers the baptism and temptation of Jesus. And before I get into that, I wanted to have kind of an introduction to the book of Matthew to tell you a little bit about the gospel. Who was Matthew? Why did he write a gospel? When did he write it? And so on, things like that. So, who was Matthew? Well, Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. When he was born, he was probably given the birth name Levi. He is possibly a son of Alphaeus, which would make him a brother to another disciple, James the Less, or James the son of Alphaeus, which actually means then there are 3 sets of brothers in the disciples, Andrew and Peter, James and John, and then Matthew and James the Less. Matthew went to work as a tax collector for the Roman Empire, which gained him hatred among the Jewish people. Now, a tax collector back then, today, would most likely be more like a customs official. Matthew lived in Capernaum, which is on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. So anything crossing the Sea of Galilee into the land of Galilee from, say, the Decapolis or the lands on the other side of the lake there, any goods brought in would be charged a customs tax. And Matthew was probably the one who collected that tax. Now, the way this worked was he had a set quota of money that he was supposed to gather for the Roman Empire, say, every month. His salary would be whatever he could collect above and beyond that quota. So what that means is he would charge so much that was required by the Romans, but then he would charge more to make money for himself. And because of this, most tax collectors became very rich. Matthew was probably a very wealthy person at the expense of other Jewish people. The Jews, remember, considered the Romans to be an enemy. They were an invading, occupying force. So to work for the Romans would make you unclean, or, it would make you hated by other Jewish people. Well, Jesus called Matthew. He just walked up to his tax collector booth, said, "Follow me." And it says Matthew left everything and followed him. Matthew continued as a disciple throughout the ministry of Jesus. And then sometime after Jesus died, Matthew wrote a biography of Jesus, which we call the Gospel of Matthew. Now, when did he write this gospel? Well, a lot of liberal scholars like to say that Matthew himself didn't actually write the gospel, and it probably wasn't written until maybe the 2nd or 3rd century. But we have evidence from the book itself that it was actually written fairly early. And one of these pieces of evidence is in Matthew chapter 24. Jesus gives a sermon called the Olivet Discourse. And in this sermon, Jesus predicts that the temple in Jerusalem is going to be overthrown and torn down. Now, if this had actually been written after that happened, which was in AD 70, just 40 years after the time of Jesus, then certainly Matthew would have mentioned it, that prophecy was fulfilled, because throughout his book, Matthew mentions prophecy being fulfilled. So, if his book was written after the destruction of the temple, certainly he would have mentioned that the temple was actually destroyed just as Jesus had prophesied. He would have said, and so the prophecy was fulfilled. So from this we can conclude, I think safely, that the book of Matthew was written sometime before AD 70. Now, why is that important? Well, what that means is, first of all, it means Matthew could very well be the actual author, which is what I believe. Secondly, it means that the book was written and being circulated at a time that people who knew Jesus were still alive. And that means that if there was anything incorrect in it, it would have been corrected and the book would have been immediately discredited. It wasn't until later that the false gospels came out, when there was no longer anyone around who was an eyewitness to Jesus. The true gospels were written fairly early, while they could still be corrected. Now, was Matthew the first gospel written? Some scholars think it was actually probably the second gospel written. They believe Mark was actually the first gospel written because of Mark's very simplistic, style, and that Matthew probably used the Gospel of Mark as a source. Now, what this means is Matthew would have taken the Gospel of Mark and a lot of the events in it, copied them into his own gospel, but maybe added some more detail or maybe left some things out that he didn't think were that important, and added some more things that he had seen himself that Mark, didn't talk about. And there's nothing wrong with that. That does not discredit the Gospel of Matthew at all, as again, some liberal scholars would like you to think. There's nothing wrong with using another book as a source. Every writer of nonfiction uses other sources, reads other books, and I don't want to say plagiarizes. They say when you steal from one writer, that's plagiarism, but when you steal from a lot of writers, that's called research. And that's what Matthew did. He just did some more research before writing his gospel, as well as drawing from his own recollections. Matthew would have been a very educated person. Being a tax collector, he certainly would have been able to read and write and do math. And he probably also was very good at taking notes. He would have been very good at writing things down. This is why Matthew gives us 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount. And if you look back in my playlists, I've got a playlist on the Sermon on the Mount that takes up about 12 weeks or so. So go back and watch that if you haven't. But he gives it in 3 chapters because very likely Matthew was taking notes during the Sermon on the Mount and was able to reproduce it almost word for word. If not actually word for word. He may have just actually dictated it as Jesus said it. So we can trust the book of Matthew to be a true account of the things that happened in the life of Jesus. Now, why did Matthew write his gospel? He wrote his gospel to Jewish Christians and to Jewish Jews to try to convert them to Christianity. We know this because throughout his gospel, Matthew is constantly trying to convince his readers that Jesus is the promised Messiah. And we know that because many times in his gospel, Matthew appeals to prophecy. He always says things that happen, and then he'll say, and this happened so that the prophecy would be fulfilled. And then he would quote a prophecy from the Old Testament. So Matthew is trying to show that Jesus is the Messiah who fulfilled all the prophecies of the Old Testament. He starts off by writing a genealogy of Jesus. He gives Jesus' family tree all the way back to Abraham. And he does this through Jesus' legal father, Joseph. Now, we all know Joseph was not Jesus' biological father, and there's a very important reason for that. But Matthew gives a lineage of Jesus back through the line of Joseph all the way back to Abraham. And he's doing this to show that Jesus is the heir to the kingdom of Israel, that Jesus is the heir to the throne of David. He shows that he's descended from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way up. He's descended from David, through Solomon, through Rehoboam, and all of the line of the kings. Now, if you know your Old Testament history, the last king of Israel, or one of the last kings of Israel, at least the last one in this bloodline, was King Jehoiakim, or in the King James Version, Matthew calls him Jeconiah. King Jehoiakim was the king when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Babylon. A prophecy was made to Jehoiakim that none of his descendants would ever sit on the throne of Israel. Now, this causes a problem because the Jews always believed that when the Messiah comes, he would be of the line of the kings and he would be the heir to the throne of Israel. But God has said this line is not going to have any descendants sit on the throne. So how can Jesus then be the heir to the throne of Israel? It's because Jesus is not a blood descendant from Jehoiakim. Jesus' mother, Mary, in the book of Luke, we see is also descended from the line of David. So Jesus is biologically a descendant of David, but he's not a descendant of the kings biologically. But he is a descendant of the kings legally, because Joseph was his legal father. Now we see why the virgin birth was so important. Jesus can now fulfill the prophecy of becoming the rightful king of Israel because he is descended from the line of the kings, but he is not a blood descendant of King Jehoiakim. A few other interesting names in Matthew's genealogy that kind of show Jesus' ancestors had an interesting past, you might say. We see that Jesus is from the tribe of Judah through his son Perez. And the interesting thing about that is that Judah had a son named Er, and Er took a wife named Tamar. And Er died before he could have any children with Tamar. So the custom at the time then was the wife would be given, the widow would be given to the next older son, which in this case was Judah's second son, Onan. And the first child from that relationship would be considered a child of the dead firstborn son. Well, Onan wasn't happy with that. Onan didn't like the idea that this child would not be considered his. So the Bible says that he practiced a form of birth control. And what he did displeased the Lord, and the Lord killed him too. Judah's third son was not yet old enough to have a wife. So Judah tells Tamar, just wait until my third son grows up a little more, then you can marry him. Tamar didn't want to wait. She wanted children. So she disguises herself as a prostitute, goes to another city. Judah goes to that city. He sees this prostitute. He goes in with her. He leaves her his staff and his ring as a down payment, you might say, until he can come back with cash. Tamar comes back. The next day, Judah goes back to retrieve his stuff, and the prostitute's not there, and nobody knows anything about her. Tamar becomes pregnant. Judah gets upset because obviously she's committed adultery. Whose child is it? And Tamar pulls out the staff and the ring and says, it's the child of the man to whom these belong. So we see here's a little scandal already within the tribe of Judah. And she ended up having twins, Perez and Zerah. Perez was the firstborn, and Jesus is actually descended from this union between Judah and his daughter-in-law. Another interesting name in there is Boaz. Boaz, you remember, is the husband of Ruth. You can read about all that in the book of Ruth. But the interesting thing about Boaz says that he is the son of a woman named Rahab. And you may remember when the Israelites were first taking the promised land, Joshua sent 2 spies into the city of Jericho. And they went around the city looking at the defenses, seeing how the attitude of the people was. And they found this prostitute named Rahab. A lot of prostitutes in Jesus' ancestry. And Rahab says, the people here are scared to death of you. They know that you're going to come and conquer this city. They know God has given the city to you. So she says, please, when you conquer the city, please spare my family's life. She then hides them while some soldiers from Jericho come in looking for the spies. And then she lets them down outside the city wall, and they promise her that they will spare her family. So because she believed in God, because she was faithful to God, her family was saved, and she ends up actually becoming an ancestor of Jesus because of her son Boaz. Boaz and Ruth have a son named Obed. Obed has a son named Jesse. Jesse has a son named King David. And this is where the line of the kings begins. And a third interesting name in this genealogy is the name Zerubbabel. If you're into Jewish history, when Cyrus the Great of Persia overthrew the Babylonian Empire, you can read about that in the book of Daniel, and he allowed the Israelites to return back to Israel. The man who led the Jews back to Israel was named Zerubbabel. This man is also an ancestor of Jesus, a man who led people to freedom. And we can see the parallel there. Jesus leads us also into freedom from captivity. So there are some interesting names. Don't skip over the genealogies when you come across them in books. Well, what happened to Matthew after he wrote his gospel? We don't know for sure. I can just tell you what the legend says. The legend says that after the Jewish temple was destroyed and the Jews were scattered all over the earth, that Matthew went to a place called Ethiopia. Now, this is probably not the Ethiopia that we know today down below Egypt in Africa. This is probably an area south of the Caspian Sea in modern-day Iran. And it says there that Matthew converted the king's daughter to Christianity. And she wanted to devote her life to Christ. Well, when that king died and a new king took the throne, the new king wanted to marry the daughter of the old king as kind of a way of sealing the kingdom, making an honest claim for the throne because my wife is the daughter of the old king, and so on. Well, Matthew said, well, come to church tomorrow. And she's going to be in church tomorrow. So come to the church and we'll see what we can do. Matthew had taken the daughter under his care when the old king had died. So the new king comes and Matthew tells the new king, she's a Christian now. She's devoting her life to Jesus. She doesn't really want to get married because she wants to devote all of her service to Jesus. And even if she were to get married, you would have to become a Christian first. This made the new king mad, and the new king ran Matthew through with a spear, killing him. So Matthew died as a martyr for the sake of Jesus, serving his Lord. This is also a piece of evidence of the truthfulness of Matthew. The story at the time that was going around the Jewish people was that the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus, that he had not actually been resurrected, that the disciples had this plot to make it look like Jesus had been resurrected. Well, if that was the case, then Matthew would have been in on it, and that means Matthew would have known that the resurrection of Jesus was a lie. He would have known that Jesus did not really come back from the dead, and that everything he was preaching was a lie. Matthew died preaching that lie. How many people do you know who would die for something that they know not to be true? Now, there are people who have died for things that aren't true, but they believed that they were. They honestly believed that they were. Matthew honestly believed in the resurrection of Christ. He honestly believed he had seen the risen Jesus. And this tells us that the disciples did not steal the body. Because if they did, then Matthew would have known about it. Matthew had seen the true, living Jesus Christ, and that's what he died preaching. In fact, 11 of the 12 disciples died preaching Jesus and his resurrection. This is one of the biggest evidences for the resurrection of Jesus, that we know the resurrection must be true, because the closest followers of Jesus honestly believed it was true. So there's an introduction to the book of Matthew. The next lesson should be coming out in another day or so, and we're going to be talking about the baptism of Jesus and his 3 temptations. We're going to see how they correspond to the 3 temptations of Eve in the Garden of Eden. So I hope to see you then.